July 1976, Montreal. Princess Anne mounts a horse named Goodwill. The judges don't know her bloodline. They don't care about her grandmother's crown. They're scoring her seat, her hands, her timing over solid timber at full gallop. For those minutes in the saddle, she isn't Her Royal Highness. She isn't the Queen's daughter. She's a rider whose execution will be measured against farmers' daughters from Devon and Olympic veterans from Germany. And somewhere on that cross-country course, the lights go out. She falls. She's concussed. She can't remember remounting, but she finishes anyway. Same decision, made twice. Tonight we're not going to Buckingham Palace. We're going to Montreal first, then up a gravel drive in rural England to understand how a woman born into crowns built herself something the institution couldn't take away. An identity that existed independent of everything they'd given her. An identity they couldn't revoke. This is the story of how Princess Anne proved she could survive without her title, and then built somewhere for that proof to live. Let me take you back to the beginning. The summer of 1976 arrived, with the British monarchy polished and positioned as a cultural anchor. Queen Elizabeth II presided over an institution that had survived the abdication crisis, the dissolution of empire, and the relentless modernization of British society. Every member of the royal family served a function, ornamental, ceremonial, representative of something larger than themselves. But for Princess Anne, Elizabeth Alice Louise, second child and only daughter of the sovereign, the question of identity had become urgent. She was 25 years old, married to Captain Mark Phillips since November 1973, and caught in the peculiar existential trap of being both somebody and nobody at once. Here's the thing about being a spare. The institution defined her completely, yet she had no constitutional role. Her brother Charles would one day be king. Her function was to exist, to appear, to represent, to be seen without ever truly being known. The psychological prison wasn't bars and locks. It was something worse. Being a princess meant never knowing if you deserved anything you had. Every achievement tainted by suspicion. Every opportunity handed rather than earned. Every smile from a stranger potentially motivated by proximity to power rather than genuine connection. How do you build a self when the institution owns every piece of you? Anne found her answer on horseback. The equestrian world offered something no other arena could provide. A space where judgment rested entirely on skill. Where bloodlines mattered only for the horses. Her love of riding had been cultivated from childhood, nurtured by a mother whose own passion for horses was legendary. But Anne pushed beyond the genteel weekend pursuits expected of royal women. She competed seriously, brutally, with an intensity that startled observers accustomed to seeing royalty as decorative rather than driven. In 1971, at just 21 years old, she won the individual European eventing championship at Burghley House in Cambridgeshire. She rode her beloved gelding Doublet to victory against the finest riders on the continent. First British royal to win a European gold medal in equestrianism. The BBC recognized this by awarding her Sports Personality of the Year. First royal ever to receive the honor. Not a courtesy nod, a legitimate sporting accomplishment that registered with the British public as genuine rather than ceremonial. Now pause here, because this is where most people miss the psychological architecture of what Anne was building. In the world of three-day eventing, judges scored dressage precision, cross-country courage, and show-jumping accuracy. None of which could be purchased with a title. None of which could be inherited through blood. When Anne entered the arena, she entered as a rider whose execution would be measured against the same standards applied to everyone else. The crown on her head became invisible the moment she mounted. This was the seductive promise of competition. For those minutes in the saddle, she existed as herself, not as the Queen's daughter, not as the Princess Royal, not as a symbol of institutional continuity, as Anne. Captain Mark Phillips understood this psychological dimension perhaps better than anyone. Phillips was himself an Olympic gold medal-winning horseman, Team Gold at the 1972 Munich Olympics, a legitimate athletic achievement that existed entirely separate from his subsequent marriage into royalty. He came from an army family rather than aristocratic lineage, a commoner who had earned his Olympic honors through skill rather than inheritance. Their relationship had been forged in the demanding world of three-day eventing, where shared understanding of competitive pressure created bonds that transcended ordinary courtship. Phillips understood what it meant to be judged solely on performance. He understood the addictive relief of competition's clarity. You either cleared the fence or you didn't. No amount of protocol could alter the outcome. The path to Montreal wasn't easy. In April 1976, approximately 3 months before the Olympic Games, Anne suffered a hairline fracture of the vertebrae in a riding accident. The injury required intensive rehabilitation, not the ceremonial ribbon cutting of royal duty. The bone-breaking reality of athletic competition at the highest level. Her decision to persist through rehabilitation toward Olympic selection suggested that Montreal held meaning beyond casual athletic interest. This wasn't a princess dabbling in sport. This was a woman fighting through spinal injury to prove something she couldn't articulate, but desperately needed to verify. What would it mean to compete at the Olympics? To be judged, truly judged, on something the institution had no role in creating? And here's what gets me about this. Anne had already won European championships. She'd already proven herself at the highest continental level. But the Olympics represented something else. A tribunal where her value would be tested independent of everything the institution had given her. Not as a British royal competing among Europeans, but as one athlete among thousands from 92 nations. Anonymous in the way that only matters when anonymity is something you've never had. July 1976, the Olympic Village buzzed with the collective nervous energy of athletes assembled for the 21st Olympiad. Princess Anne arrived not with the ceremonial fanfare typically accorded royalty, but as a member of the British equestrian team. Her accommodations no more privileged than those of her teammates. The symbolism was deliberate. For the duration of the competition, she would be a competitor, not Her Royal Highness, a rider whose performance would determine her ranking. She mounted Goodwill, a horse owned by Queen Elizabeth II, a significant symbolic detail that tied her Olympic participation to her mother's equestrian interests, while simultaneously making clear that her position on the team derived from individual selection, merit, not entitlement. In 1975, Anne had competed at the European Eventing Championships at Moulin in West Germany, riding this same horse. Silver medals in both individual and team competitions. Her Olympic participation represented the apex of an existing athletic trajectory, not a singular anomalous event. The 3-day eventing competition demanded mastery across 3 distinct disciplines. Dressage required precise control and elegant communication between horse and rider. Cross-country was the most dangerous phase: speed, courage, the ability to navigate natural obstacles at full gallop. Show jumping tested technical accuracy in a contained arena. The cross-country phase would test both horse and rider to their physical limits. The course at Montreal wound through challenging terrain, featuring solid obstacles that wouldn't give way if struck. A crucial difference from show-jumping fences designed to fall. A mistake at full gallop over solid timber could result in catastrophic injury for horse, rider, or both. Anne and Goodwill took the start, accelerating through the early obstacles with the controlled aggression the phase demanded. And then, at some point on the course that Anne herself would never clearly remember, everything went wrong. Goodwill became stuck in boggy mud. Anne was thrown from the horse. The fall was severe enough that she lost consciousness briefly. sustaining a concussion that would affect her for years to come. What happened next defined the narrative that would follow Anne throughout her life. Despite the concussion, despite the disorientation, despite the fact that she couldn't clearly process what was happening, Anne remounted Goodwill and completed the remainder of the cross-country course. Jane Holderness Rodham, Anne's former lady-in-waiting who was herself an event rider and observed the Olympics, later provided detailed testimony. Her words were unequivocal. "What I didn't know at the time was she had this awful fall, but she got back on and competed. She was that concussed that she couldn't remember, and still to this day, I believe, can't remember, the rest of the course." The memory loss wasn't metaphorical. Anne's brain had sustained enough trauma that the neural recording function simply failed, leaving a gap in her autobiographical memory that would never be filled. Years later, in 2024, when discussing another horse-related injury, Anne would reflect on Montreal with characteristic bluntness. "As far as I'm concerned, the lights went out." That phrase, the abrupt severance from conscious control, the body continuing to function while the mind recorded nothing. Yet she finished. She crossed the finish line. She completed the competition. Anne's final placement? 24th place overall. She didn't approach medal contention. The British team placed 7th. 2 of their horses were injured, forcing partial withdrawal. Anne hadn't come close to winning. And yet something far more important than a medal had been achieved. She had proven the point she needed to prove. She could fail as herself, get up as herself, finish as herself. The institution couldn't take credit or blame. Cold. The months following Montreal brought Anne face to face with the question that Olympic competition had temporarily suspended. What would she do with the identity she had proven existed? The equestrian career would continue, but competition provided only episodic opportunities for self-definition. Between events, she returned to royal duties, the ceremonial calendar, the institutional obligations that treated her individual identity as irrelevant to her function. The tension between these two modes of existence demanded resolution. Queen Elizabeth II purchased Gatcombe Park in 1976 as a wedding gift for Princess Anne and Captain Mark Phillips. The property represented a significant investment, between £500,000 and £750,000, equivalent to approximately $6.8 million in today's currency. The Queen's willingness to make such an investment reflected both her understanding of Anne's need for independent space and her recognition that the marriage required a domestic establishment suited to their shared equestrian interests. But here's the part that matters. Gatcombe wasn't merely a house, it was a working estate. Extensive stabling for horses, land that could sustain agricultural operations, a place where the equestrian life Anne had built could have permanent roots. Anne and Mark Phillips moved into Gatcombe in November 1977, more than a year after both the Olympic competition and the property purchase. This extended timeline allowed the meaning of both events to deepen. When Anne and Mark finally took up residence, they entered not merely a home, but a project, a working estate that would require active management rather than passive occupation. Anne's response would reveal whether Olympic competition had been an isolated gesture of independence or the first expression of a comprehensive philosophy about self-sufficiency and earned value. In a 2014 interview with the BBC's Country File program, Anne articulated her approach with striking directness. "It's really nice to come back and just be yourself in an area like this. Being able to take on a place like this, for me, I've got to make it work. This is not something that comes free. This has got to pay its way. Otherwise, I can't stay here." Read that again. Otherwise, I can't stay here. She didn't conceptualize Gatcombe as a royal gift to be maintained through institutional resources. She understood it as a personal responsibility requiring active management and demonstrated financial viability. The phrase suggests Anne had internalized a conditional relationship with the property, one in which her continued occupation depended on her success at making it work. This was identity insurance manifest in real estate, a place where the self-proven at Montreal could be housed, exercised, and sustained independent of institutional support. The working farm component included livestock operations, cattle, breeding horses. Beyond agricultural production, the estate generated revenue through hosting equestrian events. Most notably, the Festival of British Eventing ran annually from 1983 to 2023, a major international equestrian competition that attracted world-class riders and over 40,000 paying spectators. 40 years of continuous operation demonstrated that Gatcombe had become genuinely self-sustaining. Anne had built something real, not a hobby estate maintained by royal prerogative, a functioning agricultural and equestrian business that would survive regardless of institutional favor. But the deepest verification of Anne's identity construction project came not in her own Olympic performance or her estate management. It came in the choices she made regarding her children. Zara Ann Elizabeth Tyndall was born on May 15, 1981. Peter Mark Andrew Phillips followed. Anne's first and second children with Mark Phillips. At their births, constitutional protocol would have made courtesy titles available. Queen Elizabeth II could have conferred HRH status and designated titles that would have positioned the children within the formal hierarchy of the royal family. Anne declined. This decision represented perhaps the most significant expression of the philosophy Anne had been building since before Montreal. She explicitly intended to provide her children a more normal childhood and allow them to develop identities and professional lives independent of royal status. The decision wasn't merely sentimental or protective in the conventional parental sense. It was structural. Anne was deliberately refusing to enclose her children within the institutional framework that she herself had struggled to transcend. Zara and Peter Phillips would grow up as commoners, their value determined by what they achieved rather than what they inherited. The identity insurance Anne had built for herself through Olympic competition and Gatcombe self-sufficiency would now extend to the next generation. Not through inherited status, but through demonstrated principle. Zara developed an equestrian career following in both her parents' footsteps, but crucially, she did so under her own name, without royal title or institutional support. After studying physiotherapy at Exeter University, Zara pursued professional event riding with the same competitive intensity her mother had demonstrated. The results validated the approach. In 2006, Zara won the individual eventing world title at Aachen, becoming the eventing world champion, an achievement that exceeded anything her mother had won in international competition. Following this world championship victory, Zara was named BBC Sports Personality of the Year in 2006, the same award her mother had won in 1971. Mother and daughter became the only two members of the British royal family to receive this honor, creating a lineage of competitive achievement that existed entirely outside institutional recognition. Isn't that wild? At the 2012 London Summer Olympics held in her home country, Zara competed in the team eventing event, riding her horse, High Kingdom. The British team won silver medals. Zara stood on the Olympic podium as an athlete who had earned her place through demonstrated skill rather than royal privilege. The scene that followed captured something essential about the identity Anne had spent decades constructing. Princess Anne, in her capacity as president of the British Olympic Association, presented the medals to the winning team, including her own daughter. The moment was simultaneously official and deeply personal. A mother handing an Olympic medal to the daughter she had deliberately raised without royal title. In recognition of achievement, the institution had no role in creating. 3 generations of riders now existed who had proven themselves on merit. Queen Elizabeth II herself was an accomplished horsewoman. Anne had competed in the Olympics and won European championships. Zara had become world champion and Olympic medalist. But only Zara competed under her own name, without institutional armor or royal protection. The identity Anne had fought to construct for herself, the self that existed outside institutional definition, had become inheritable, not through blood or title, but through example and deliberate parental choice. Now here's where the story delivers its final payoff. June 23, 2024. Princess Anne sustained injuries at Gatcombe Park after an incident involving a horse. She was 73 years old. The injuries included a concussion and minor wounds to the head, requiring hospitalization and a temporary withdrawal from public duties. The irony was unmistakable. Anne had been injured at the very place she had established as the home for her independent identity, by the very animals that had provided her pathway to self-definition outside institutional constraints. She had suffered a concussion, the same injury that erased her memory of Olympic competition, but couldn't erase her completion of the course. Anne's response to the 2024 injury echoed her response to Montreal, nearly 5 decades earlier. She recovered. She returned to work within months. She resumed the punishing schedule of royal engagements that had made her consistently the hardest-working member of the family by measurable metrics. The lights had gone out again, as they had in 1976, but as before, she got back up. In interviews following the accident, Anne acknowledged that hospital staff had to fill in the blanks regarding what had happened, just as her recollection of the Montreal cross-country course had never returned. 2 concussions 48 years apart, both inflicted by horses, both leaving gaps in her autobiographical memory, both followed by the same response: return to work, continue competing, refuse to cede ground to injury or age. The lights went out, and she kept riding anyway. Someone on Reddit once wrote something that captures precisely what Anne spent 50 years building. Anne made something of herself outside the royal family. She's an Olympic-level equestrian. If the RF was overthrown in a coup, Anne could make a living because she has a sense of purpose. Crude, but illuminating. A self that could survive institutional collapse. The equestrian career wasn't hobby, but insurance. The farm wasn't retreat, but fortress. The identity proven at Montreal and housed at Gatcombe was specifically designed to have value the institution could neither grant nor revoke. The question embedded in Anne's half-century project remains open for interpretation. Was the equestrian career passion or survival strategy? And honestly, I think the answer is that the distinction collapses under examination. Genuine passion provided the vehicle through which survival strategy could be executed. The love of horses was real. No one sustains 50 years of physical punishment in a dangerous sport without authentic engagement. But the decision to pursue that passion into Olympic competition, to prove herself in arenas where blood meant nothing and skill meant everything, to build an estate that had to pay its way, to decline titles for her children. These were strategic choices made by someone who understood the precariousness of identity within institutional frameworks. Montreal, 1976. Gatcombe, 2024. 48 years of the same choice, the same philosophy, the same refusal to let the institution define the boundaries of her capacity. The summer of 1976 began with a princess mounting a horse named Goodwill in Montreal. The lights went out somewhere on the cross-country course, but Anne finished anyway. She would spend the next 5 decades finishing, completing the course, building the farm, declining the titles, earning the identity. The institution owned her title. It didn't own her talent. Gatcombe was where the talent lived. and still lives. Even now. Even after the lights went out again in 2024, and she got back up again because that is what she has always done. What the Olympic competition taught her she could do. What the farm existed to prove she would always be able to do. The self she built at Montreal and housed at Gatcombe survived every fall because it was designed to survive falling. That was the whole point.